Everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Construction Risk Management Seminar. We're happy you're here and we're excited about the presentation. My name is Chris Thatch. I'm here with Mike Dingman and Dave Hedinger. Mike and I are partners in and head up McGuire Woods construction practice. And we're a group of about 40 lawyers throughout the country and internationally. We have a soup to nuts practice. We do everything from drafting contracts and advising, counseling clients on contracts to project and risk management during execution, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And then, of course, litigation and disputes from actual traditional litigation through arbitrations and all sorts of different forums. Dave is an expert and consultant who has done a ton of construction work and who we've worked with quite a bit on projects. So he'll tell you more about him and his background once we get to his section of the presentation. This is our rough agenda. We're going to do a brief intro, and then we'll go through key contractual issues for risk and project management, which Mike will talk about. I'll talk about project management, effectively managing contracts during project execution. We'll take a short break, about 5 minutes. And then Dave and Mike and I will chime in as well, but Dave will head our discussion about AI and tech tools. We're really hoping that takes up the bulk of today's presentation because there are a lot of interesting things to discuss there. So that's where we will head. And then, of course, question and answer. There is an option for Q&A here in the tool. So feel free to throw your questions in as we move, and we'll do our best to monitor the Q&A and answer your questions at the appropriate time. All right, Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning again, everyone. I'm Mike Dingman, and as Chris said, I head up with him our construction group here at McGuire Woods. I've been practicing in the construction area for more than 35 years, and one of the things that our group does is take clients from contract to project management, and if necessary, to disputes. And so the genesis of this presentation was our experience in trying to mitigate risks and enhance project management to avoid risks altogether. And one of the themes that came from that is the use of knowledge from our projects in real time and in an effective way, because complex projects, as you all know, gather a tremendous amount of data. But our experience is often that data is not effectively used, and therefore the gathering of the data in the end is not very effective in enhancing project management and mitigating risks. And that's really the theme of our presentation today, is how to apply the knowledge from a strong agreement to project management, and then extracting the data from all of the information that's gathered weekly, monthly on any project to effectively use it. As everyone is aware, the famous quote, "Knowledge is power," but as Chekhov says, it's of no value unless you put it into practice. And what we want to talk about today is how you can put into practice the knowledge of a good contract into project management, and then how you analyze data to gain the knowledge to put into practice mitigation techniques. And as Carly Fiorina says, the goal is to transform that data into information and information into insight so that it can be useful. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, looking at three aspects of any project. One is having a strong agreement up front, because that's the foundation for good project management and risk mitigation. And then how do you actually apply the knowledge and power of that agreement in your project management? And then, as Chris was saying, we're going to focus quite a bit on how you can use emerging technologies and AI to effectively gather and analyze the tremendous amount of data gathered for projects. So I'm going to start off with a discussion of key issues for risk management and project management on most contracts. And the first topic we're going to talk about is the requirements for project data, because that's the foundation for the information and knowledge needed to effectively manage the project and to avoid risk. And while this may seem fairly straightforward, I see many agreements where there's not a lot of detail about what project data information the contractor or subcontractors are required to provide. And so it is important to lay that out into some detail. Just as an example, most projects require monthly reports, but identifying what is required to be in those reports is very important. And the two key ones to me are identifying key issues and problems that exist currently on the project, but also potential issues or problems and how those are going to be addressed. And one of the things Chris will talk about is it's important during project construction to follow up on these issues and run them to ground. So the first step, though, is let's gather the information. What's going on the project? What change orders are out there? Obtain monthly schedule updates, and perhaps even just a synopsis of the schedule update for that month. What are the key issues that are being identified in the schedule updates? Having weekly meetings. Most projects will do that as a matter of course, whether it's an OAC meeting or a meeting of subcontractors. And it's important to track those meetings accurately. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment when we talk about notices, so that, again, you can extract in more detail on a weekly basis what's happening on the project. What do we need to plan for? What are some issues that we see coming down the road? And the same thing with the look-ahead schedule. What are we projecting to accomplish in the next week or the next 2 weeks or whatever the period might be? And how are we actually going to achieve that? So the foundation is to have in your agreement, this is the data that the contractor or the subcontractor is required to provide. And sometimes I've seen and we've used form monthly reports. This is the data and the information that needs to be inputted on a regular basis. So it's important to spend a little bit of time in your contract thinking about what information do I want from my contractor or subcontractor and in what format, so it's useful to me. The next issue we're going to talk about is one that surprisingly I see often neglected in agreements, and that is, well, what happens if the schedule update for a particular month shows that the project is behind schedule? What are the rights of the owner or the contractor to deal with that issue? And what we often put in our agreements is a provision that would lay out what the owner or the contractor can require in order to try to make up those delays or at least mitigate their impact. And it's not enough simply to require these monthly schedule updates unless there's some provision in the agreement that gives you the ability to do something about it if you're starting to see the schedule slide. And so the couple of things that we typically would put in our agreement is if the owner or the contractor on their own determine, or based on a monthly update, that the project is falling behind, demand a recovery plan with the schedule analysis. Tell me what you're going to do to make up this time, and put that into a schedule analysis so I can see and determine whether it's going to be effective. Require action such as overtime or extra shifts or whatever is necessary to regain that schedule. And you need to have prompt implementation with consequences. In other words, if the contractor, the subcontractor is not engaging in these actions to recover the schedule, what are your rights? Can you require them to start working overtime yourself? Can you add your own additional manpower? So you need to think about having some teeth to these requirements, because simply saying, give us a recovery plan, and not being able to require with some effective contractual obligations, implementation and completion of that recovery plan makes it much less useful. A theme that you're going to hear throughout, especially in Chris's presentation, is prompt, consistent application based on project data is vital. In other words, if you see the project schedule slipping and you do nothing about it for months and months and months, then there becomes this issue of, well, is it an actual problem? Why have you not asked me to do something before? Have you waived your right to make the contractor, the subcontractor, engage in these activities to recover the plan or the schedule? So it's important to stay on top of the knowledge and information provided per the contract. And Chris will talk about that, and so will Dave, on how you successfully use that information. But consistent application is vital across the board to maintain your contractual rights. So the next major issue that we look at in agreements, not surprisingly, is the change order process. And I would say that the majority of disputes that I've been involved in find their origin in improper change order documentation or lack of clarity, where the parties believe they've resolved an issue in a particular manner, and then when the rubber hits the road, they have very divergent views of what that change order accomplished. And so the foundation, again, is a good, clear process in your agreement in order to implement a change order. Deadlines for submissions are vital. You cannot have change order issues linger, and I see that all the time on projects. What's the backup information? And it's not just cost and schedule analysis, which is very important, obviously, but what is the issue precisely that's being addressed by the change order? Because that's where there's often conflict and dispute later on, is the language of the change order lacks the clarity necessary for each side to fully understand what is it that we're resolving here. And so having that process outlined in your agreement is vital. And then, of course, as Chris will talk about, following that process and practice is necessary to protect yourself from these disputes that often arise from change orders that not only lack clarity, but are they resolving the subject of the change order across the board? And one of the issues we often see in change orders is they're left somewhat open-ended, where a contractor or subcontractor can come back later and say, well, there's been subsequent impacts from this issue from 8 months ago, and so we have another change order, we have another claim. So it's important to make sure that your agreement says once a change order is executed, that closes the door on that topic and that issue. It's resolved. And then follow that through in your change order forms. A process that I think is also important to maintain both for owners and contractors is the ability to issue a construction change directive if you cannot reach agreement on terms, because the project needs to move forward. You also therefore need to have a very clear process for the CCD, which identifies timelines. If the owner or the contractor says, this is what I think is appropriate, then the contractor, the subcontractor has a discrete period of time to respond in detail as to why they disagree and what they believe the change should be, so that it's clearly documented what the position is of both sides. But that's an important tool to have on the owner and the contractor side, because you cannot lose time negotiating a change order where you just can't get to an agreement. So implementing the change order process, as Chris will talk about, is vital, but the foundation is laying it out in your contract clearly so everyone understands their obligations. And of course, everyone's favorite, the claims process. And this is one where I think agreements often are found wanting because they do not clearly define what the process is, what the notice should look like, timelines for submission. So again, it's important in your contract to lay that foundation and then take that knowledge and implement it in your project management. So a couple of key items for any claims process. You need to have a clear deadline for submission with consequences. In other words, if there's no submission within 21 days or 15 days, whatever you agree to in your agreement, from the time the event occurs, then it should be waived. Now, contractors and subcontractors often bristle a little bit at that. But the problem is if there's no consequence, then missing that deadline becomes meaningless. So you can have deadlines in your agreement, but if it's silent on what happens if the deadline's missed, then that leaves it open to interpretation. And it's not something that's intended to be a gotcha provision. It's really an important project management tool to get issues surfaced timely so they can be addressed timely before they snowball into bigger issues and claims. So having a firm deadline with consequences is vital. Another important item is what constitutes a notice of claim. And I can tell you that in the disputes that we've been involved in, this is always a dispute. Is it enough that it's mentioned in meeting minutes or monthly reports or emails or some memoranda? Because often those deadlines for submission are missed. And when that happens, the person who missed the deadline is now looking for some way to pull themselves within the requirements of the notice. And that's often meeting minutes and reports where issues are talked about. And so it's important to describe what a notice of claim should look like. And it should say, it's a notice of claim. Here's the relief that's being requested, and here's the reason why that relief is being requested. So having some definition of what a notice is very important. And then, of course, implementing that in practice. Because I can tell you, having seen this in courts and in arbitration, if it's unclear what the notice of claim is to look like, then it opens the door to arguments that any other project document that mentions an issue or says we could have a problem here, there's an argument to be made that that complied with the notice requirement. And so spending some time in your agreement specifying what the notice of claim must look like is very important. And not surprisingly, requiring the specificity and description of the claim is vital. It's same issue with the change orders. Claims are often made and resolved, but again, with a lack of clarity as to what was the issue, how is it being resolved, and does this resolution close it out? And so it's very important to require the specificity and what the relief is, and of course the backup for it so it can be analyzed. And one of the key things to me that is often missing is a competent schedule analysis for delay claims. You should always require a fragnet or some sort of schedule analysis that you can analyze to see if the critical path is being impacted and why, is there float. So there's a whole host of issues relating to delay claims that require clear statement from who's ever making the claim as to what the impact is and the activities that are involved so that a good analysis can be done up front. And again, consistent enforcement, as Chris will talk about, of claims is vital. And we see this all the time where project participants, and there's nothing wrong with this, are trying to get along, trying to get the project across the finish line, and will sometimes let these issues slide or say, don't worry, you can get back to me in a couple of months and let's see where we stand and those sort of things. And we understand everyone's trying to work together and have a successful project. But if you fall into that pattern, then these deadlines with consequences are not as effective. So it's important to lay it out very clearly in your agreement. And then as Chris will talk about it, to consistently apply it throughout your project. The last key contractual issue we're going to talk about is termination. And it is, of course, a remedy of last resort. It is sort of the nuclear reaction to a problem. But I will tell you, in my experience, I've seen many project participants who allow underperforming contractors or subcontractors to continue far too long. And often the performance does not get better. And you get to a point where it's almost impossible to replace that underperforming contractor or subcontractor. So then you're sort of stuck with them trying to limp your way across the finish line of your project. And so now, while I'm not advocating having a quick trigger on terminations for default, it is important to stay on top of underperforming contractors or subcontractors and to be able to look at the data and make a decision. Is it best now to pull the plug on this contractor or subcontractor because I'm not seeing any indication that their performance is going to turn around? And again, I've seen owners and contractors give too much time to contractors or subcontractors to turn it around, and for obvious reasons. Replacing a contractor or subcontractor on a project is very difficult. But sometimes the alternative of allowing that poor performance to continue and to snowball is worse. And so you need to stay on top of that sub or contractor and make your own determination of, can they really turn this around? Can they really get us to the finish line? And in a timely manner. Because a lot of remedies, for example, liquidated damages, often have caps. And I've been on projects where, the delay is such that the cap is long gone. And so there's very little remedy left for the owner or the contractor. And so you have to bear in mind these limitations on your remedies as you're analyzing the ability of this contractor or subcontractor to turn it around and get back on schedule, which is typically the issue. So again, your contract needs to lay the foundation for the ability to implement a termination for default if you make that determination. And it's important to state clearly in the contract, what are the basis for termination? And what are the remedies if you terminate? Because this is a significant event. Most contractors or subcontractors are not going to be happy, obviously, if they're terminated for default. And so you need to lay out very clearly, these are the bases for that type of termination. And then what happens if that termination takes place? What rights do you have to maintain the materials or equipment of the contractor or the subcontractor? Do you have the right to not make any payment until you have resolved the issues caused by the termination? Do you want to provide a cure period? And I think it's typical to have some cure period, but you also need to think about in your contract, what if it's just not possible to cure the issue? And a lot of these cure periods, the language I see, and I would suggest you avoid, is if they're making progress towards curing the default, even though not within the required period, then they get to keep going. I think it's important to limit that because practically speaking, the owner or the contractor, if they think their progress is being made, then they can make that decision independently. But if you put it in the agreement, well, if they're making progress, then they shouldn't be defaulted. It opens up a debate. If there's a dispute later on, were they making sufficient progress such that the default was not justified? And so the cure periods, I think, are important. You typically do not want to default and terminate folks, but you also have to have discrete time limits. And if you're going to provide that cure period, who has the right contractually to say, sorry, you've not done enough, or you have, and so we'll give you some additional time. As you're looking at a termination for default and the aftermath of that, it's also important to have good information on the damage and the time impact for that default. And that, again, is predicated on having good project data and having the ability to access that data in an effective way, which is what we're going to talk about with Dave and also with Chris. So this is how it all sort of ties together. The contract rights, the ability to enforce your remedies to have the proper data to support your claim. And often on projects, and we see this, there's an enormous amount of data. So the backup is there if you know how to find it and extract it and use it in an effective way. The last thing we'll mention on terminations is a termination for convenience, which is in most agreements we see. It's obviously a less risky alternative because you're not terminating for default. You can just say, things are not working out. We've decided view is typically there are very limited remedies for termination for convenience. He's saying there's not a default here, even though that what I have seen in my experience with most terminations for convenience, it's because of lack of performance. We'll just terminate for convenience and move on. That may make sense in some circumstances, but the thing to keep in mind is if you make that type of termination for convenience, then it's very difficult to seek any sort of redress for delays or other issues by the contractor or subcontractor because you're not terminating them for default. And I've seen this play out in courts, and judges are very skeptical of claims made against a contractor or subcontractor who was terminated for convenience. And often the judges will say, if you think there was a default, then you had this other remedy, and that's what you should have implemented. I'm not going to let you now come back and make claims against this contractor or subcontractor who you terminated for convenience. So a lot of folks default to that termination for convenience because it's not as difficult and challenging as a termination for default, but there are some downsides to taking that option. And so these are some of the basic key terms and provisions in contracts that we focus on. There are many others, but these are the ones for project management and risk mitigation that we think are key and vital. And one of the issues that's very important, and this is what Chris is going to now pick up on, is educating your project management team about these good provisions you've negotiated in your agreement. Because much like knowledge, if it's not used, it's useless. Strong contractual terms, if they're not used, often become useless as well. And so Chris is going to now pick up with, we've got a great contract. How do we make sure our project management team is implementing it in the field so that it can be effective?
Great. Thanks, Mike. Well, hello, everyone. Again, I'm Chris Thatch. I'm in our DC office at McGuire Woods, and I've been practicing litigation and construction litigation in particular, and counseling on construction issues for several years. And we want to talk in this next portion of the presentation about, Mike has discussed, we've got a great contract. Now, what do we do with it? Oftentimes what we found is that if a contract isn't understood, isn't available, frankly, for the folks who are on the ground, who are managing decisions, who are receiving the claims notices, receiving correspondence about delay, then we're at a real disadvantage in terms of how you're handling those notices and ultimately responding to those notices. And so really what we're talking about here are some fairly straightforward ideas for how to build, no pun intended, an internal infrastructure within, whether it's the owner or the contractor within your organization to be able to be on top of the issues in the contract and understand how to apply them. I mean, we are very aware of the fact that sometimes lawyers are involved in this execution process, and sometimes they're not. And that'll be a decision that your own individual organization will have to make. But we feel very strongly, and we've advised several of our clients, that even if there isn't a lawyer or there aren't litigators who are directly involved in the project execution phase as construction is going on, What can we do to help those clients build a robust infrastructure of folks at the front end of execution to make sure that those folks, even if they don't have legal background or they're not litigators by training, have the tools to properly execute the contract during construction. So we're going to talk about four things here, four just really guidelines, guideposts that we often provide to every one of our clients on how to effectively manage a contract during execution. And again, they're fairly straightforward, but they're often completely missed in the build up to and the harriedness of getting the project started, getting things moving, making sure deadlines are being followed. So we'll talk about following the contract. We'll talk about responding to notices of correspondence. We're talking about maintaining clear and contemporaneous documentation, which is a big one, and which will be even more relevant as we get into the later parts of this presentation and talk about technology and AI tools, and then monitoring the schedule. All of these things developed from and built around our own experiences with clients, and piggybacking on Mike's advice on particular contract provisions to be aware of and to pay close attention to when you are drafting the contract. So, the first is follow the contract, and it sounds fairly straightforward. It sounds obvious, but we have been surprised, frankly, at how many of our clients, even our most sophisticated clients, both on the owner and contractor side, aren't nearly as familiar with the contract that they have agreed to once execution begins. We met with a client about a month or so ago who was discussing an issue that they had on one of their projects. And he literally described, I had to open up the drawer in the back office and pull the contract out to familiarize myself with the provisions that were relevant to the issue that had come up and that we were facing. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We want to build an infrastructure and a process at the front end where everyone involved in the project who needs to be in the know and who is making decisions with respect to correspondence back and forth between subs and contractors and owners, and writing out correspondence, keeping track of the schedule and whatever software database you're using, is aware of what the contract says with respect to those provisions that, for instance, Mike talked about. And as Mike said, we have seen numerous disputes. I would say it's probably fair to say that 90 some odd % of the disputes that we come across in both litigation or arbitration have to do with someone not understanding what they were obligated to do in the contract with respect to, say, a claims notice or a response to a particular issue that came up in a change order, and that derailed the entire project and led to a multi-million-dollar dispute. When in fact, if we had just gone back 2 years before and had someone involved at the front end who could have helped to craft that response, it would have been a completely different outcome on the case. So it's about knowing and understanding the obligations that relate to some of the most critical parts of the contract that are going to come up over and over and over again during project execution. One of the things that we've done for clients, and clients have found very helpful, is to meet with them at the very front end of the project. Once the contract is drafted, once we've helped them work through the language and everything's been inked, and going through the contract and identifying the provisions that are most important for them to know and understand as execution is happening, and to create guidelines and cheat sheets even for those provisions that, sort of cut through all of the legalese in the contract and just simply, very straightforward, list out in bullets, X happens, Y is the response. And this is what the contract says. This is the process that's put forward in the contract and that you have agreed to with respect to these particular actions. And what we're talking about here primarily are, a lot of the contract provisions that Mike talked about in his portion. I mean, I found, and I think Mike would agree that, issues of, and Mike already talked about change orders, and claim notices. Those are provisions to watch out for and make sure that the project personnel on the ground are aware of what the contract says and what our obligations are with respect to those things. Delay, obviously, which Mike talked a lot about, and also the schedule and monitoring the schedule, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Notice requirements, even at the most basic level. I mean, all of you are aware that, oftentimes in these, several 100-page contracts, there are very, very specific requirements for who gets noticed about what and when and in what format. We have seen countless disputes and arguments over simple notice provisions that, there's a provision on page 502 of the contract that's buried in there that discusses how parties are and should be notified with respect to particular issues that come up during a project. Those are very easy to pull out of that contract and just to frame out for the folks who are involved in the project. The other thing that we didn't have a chance to talk about in detail today, but Mike and I have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues recently, are insurance issues, which come up frequently on these massive projects. And we're thinking of, to what extent notice is required to an insurer with respect to claims, to what extent responses are required back to insurance providers when they are inquiring about whether it's progress on the project or issues that are coming up that they're being identified about on the project. We have spent a lot of time with clients just helping tease out what those requirements are around insurance, and those are involved in almost every contract we see. So the second high level directive here that we often give our clients is respond thoughtfully to all notices and correspondence. Again, it sounds fairly easy and straightforward and kind of an obvious, of course we would do that. But the reality is, and Mike alluded to this during his portion, on a multi-billion dollar project, there are a ton of moving parts. There are a ton of people involved, and there is paper flying back and forth constantly, literally by the day, if not by the hour. And so things can get missed. And in particular, correspondence back and forth between the stakeholders is extremely important, not only to keep track of, but to respond to. And responding to it promptly and timely based on the provisions and the requirements in the contract, making sure that your response is complete. As all of you know, sometimes you can get a 5-page letter from a contractor that talks about 10 different pieces of the project and potential issues or problems or delays. All of those issues that are crammed into those letters need to be addressed specifically and promptly. Or you may be in a position where the other side can easily make a waiver argument, or something gets lost in one of those letters and you think you've covered everything, but then it rears its ugly head a year or 2 years later, and all of a sudden you're behind the 8 ball in terms of your substantive response. So making sure you understand exactly what's being communicated. Sometimes letters and correspondence, we as lawyers have a certain way that we'd like to draft letters, very particular, but sometimes that's not often the case. Sometimes there are folks drafting the correspondence or the notices who aren't thinking through a lawyer's lens, aren't thinking through a litigator's lens, and aren't paying close attention to every piece and every detail, whether it's the most minute references to a piece of equipment or a part of the work scope that an issue is being raised about. Ensuring that you understand exactly what's being communicated, and if you don't, making sure that you're asking for clarification. What ultimately happens in these projects, as all of you know, and Dave's going to talk a lot about this, is that you are building a record and a story of what has happened on your project. And your story at the end of the day is only as good as the paper that you've accumulated to support it. And that all of those notices that are flying back and forth during project execution are going to be closely scrutinized if and when a dispute comes up. They're going to be, their lawyers are going to have eyes on them. They're going to be brought up in depositions. They're going to be raised immediately when claims are threatened. And so the attention that you put toward those notices and that paperwork at the later stages, our strong recommendation is, as best you can and are able, put that same attention to all of that paperwork and those notices on the front end in real time, so that you are well equipped, if necessary, later on down the road, to pull out that paper, to pull out that correspondence and notices and say, look, this is exactly what we said. And then, of course, it goes without saying, but treating your own notices with equal care, right? If you're ready to fire off a letter to an owner about issues that you feel like have come up on the schedule, or things that maybe that you believe the owner has done to impede the schedule and to impede progress, or to impact the work scope, then make sure that you are drafting that notice as completely and specifically and as carefully as possible. These are just some things that's, as we've gone on in our careers, and this is particularly for folks who maybe just aren't thinking in the moment contemporaneously about a dispute, because often non-lawyers aren't. We are, but non-lawyers aren't. But what are some of the things that you could highlight in correspondence to raise eyebrows, to raise red flags? And we've worked with clients oftentimes, not unlike providing guideposts and cheat sheets for contract provisions. We've often sat down with project managers and engineers who are the boots on the ground, who are the first line of defense, so to speak, with respect to interactions between owner and contractor, or contractor and subcontractor, and said, look, here's some things that you need to look out for in these notices, right? We know your time is absolutely precious, and that your highest priority is getting this project done and built and completed in a timely manner. But pay attention to the things that are being included in and described in these notices. And if there are certain words, buzzwords, that we can help familiarize that staff with, then it makes it a lot easier for them to identify the particularly problematic notices that are coming through the pipe. And again, coming through in a rapid fire way. So the third thing we've already alluded
just to follow up on that, those are the buzzwords to look at in monthly reports and weekly meeting minutes and so forth. Because if there's not timely notice, those are the documents that the other side will point back to and say, well, I told you about this in this monthly report, or I told you about this at our weekly meetings. And so you should be looking for those buzzwords in those documents as well. And if you see them, then you need to ask, what are you going to do about this issue, right? How is it going to be resolved? Because what we often see is an issue's raised in a monthly report, for example, and it just lingers. It's in the next 3, 4, or 5 monthly reports, and you ask people after the fact, well, what happened? Did it get resolved? And nobody has a clear answer. So you also need in these reports and updates to keep an eye out for these phrases. And if you see something like disruption, delay, slowdown, inefficiency, you need to probe, right? And say, okay, well, what's going on here, and what's the plan, right, to deal with it? Because often we'll see issues come up, and these monthly reports are very lengthy, and no one appears to be paying attention. And you ask people again after the fact, why did this issue continue to be in the monthly report month after month after month? And nobody has a clear answer for that. And so look for these phrases and those types of documents as well.
No, that's a great point, Mike. And it just goes back to the idea that, once you're involved in a dispute and claims have been filed, and there's a judge who's looking at this evidence, the judge, at least in my experience, the judge isn't thinking, wow, you guys were really busy during project execution, so it makes complete sense that maybe some of these things are falling through the cracks. The judge's perspective is almost always, who on earth was paying attention to this? And to Mike's point, sometimes a claims notice is drafted and directed to a stakeholder, and it's very obvious what the issue is. But if it's something that's buried in a monthly report, or maybe it's buried in a 5-page email, then it may be harder to identify what the problem is or what the issue is and what should be done about it. So that's a great point. Thanks, Mike. So the next thing we'll talk about, and we've already alluded to this, and this is going to come up a lot when Dave talks about AI and technology. But I mean, it is critical to maintain contemporaneous documentation throughout the project. And most sophisticated contractors and some owners are very good at this. And there are all sorts of software programs, obviously, that are available to help make this possible. But it's still important, even the most sophisticated stakeholders who are involved in projects, to from the very outset make sure that you have prepared and are in a position to not only identify and maintain, but organize documents in a meaningful way so that they can be helpful to the project. And again, this goes back to this idea of what's the story you're telling at the end of the day? And it may not necessarily be a story that you're telling a judge or arbitrator. It may be a story that you're telling a year into the project to a contractor in order to explain your position on a particular issue, or to tamp down a potential dispute that's gaining traction and that's getting everyone's attention. The better equipped you are to have created and maintained a complete and well-documented system of project activities, the better off you'll be. And it's not just the schedule. I mean, the schedule obviously is the number one most critical piece, and obviously observing and keeping track of critical paths and such. But it's just as important to make sure that, as Michael alluded to, you have a proper handle on and have organized monthly reports. You have a proper handle on and have organized the most important correspondence that's being sent back and forth between owner and contractor, or contractor and subcontractor. All of these things will help to tell your story down the road. And frankly, in our experience, the more you can show in an adjudication process versus tell, the better off you are. It's always better to have a long list of documents that you can pull up as an exhibit and show to a judge or a jury that documents exactly what happened in real time versus a witness maybe having to go back and recreate the issues 2 or 3 years after the fact. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. I mean, I had a trial several years ago that involved a project, a massive project that went on for 8 to 10 years, and it was a government project. And so the monthly reporting was very it was laid out. It was identified the requirements for it, and it was followed very closely by all of the people involved in the project. We walked in every day to court with just a stack of binders with all of the monthly reports over that entire project course of time. And it was incredibly effective just for the other side to see those binders, to see that we were armed with everything that, from our view, had happened on that project. So that's what we tell clients. The better equipped you are to maintain these documents and to make sure that they're organized, that you're not missing anything, the better off you are down the road if a dispute comes up. And look, this will depend on your particular project. I think that the documents that we have highlighted here oftentimes are, from our perspective, the ones that are the most critical in terms of project maintenance. But really, all of these items can be important depending on the project. Obviously, we've talked a lot about internal and external correspondence. Those can be incredibly important depending on how your project has decided and the stakeholders have decided to actually maintain documents and reporting and communicate with each other during the project. If it's all meant to be through official documentation, official notices, meeting minutes, that's one thing. But if the default is to communicate primarily through correspondence, then all the more reason to pay attention, very close attention to that correspondence. Again, photographs and video recordings, depending on the sophistication of the project and what you provided for in the contract, there may be an opportunity and an outlet for, close documentation, whether it's by video or by photo of evidence of the progress that's being made over time on the project. If that is a part of the project and it's part of the normal activities during execution, make sure that you have a handle on that. Make sure that you have someone in particular who is part of the project team who is responsible for gathering that information, and that you know where it's going. And Mike had alluded to this during his portion of the presentation, but for the projects that are the highest value and are the most significant, sometimes just finding the information is a challenge. So it's important to not only have the tool or tools that you're planning to implement, but understand how they work, to have a handle on the process that's going to be applied to use those tools to maintain the information, and to have people who are directly involved in the project who know how those tools work and who are specifically responsible for maintaining those documents and the information.
Just one thing I would add on this, Chris, is we see this all the time in significant disputes. They linger for months, and there are emails and memos and meeting minutes and all of these documents that you're seeing. And one of the challenges is being consistent with your position across the board. And so that's something that you need to track, and Dave can talk a little bit about maybe how AI and technology can help with that. What we often see is the project manager, assistant project manager, project executive, various different people are getting involved in disputes, especially when they're significant. And sometimes the position's not the same. And when you end up in a dispute, that's what's exploited by the other side. Well, yes, you're saying that here, but Joe told me, don't worry about it. And here's the email from Joe. And so that's just something to be mindful of, is that when you have significant issues, being consistent in your messaging and making sure that there's a discrete number of people who are delivering that message. Because what we often see when you get too many people involved and there's a lot of emails flying around, it's difficult to stay on top of what your message is. And if it's not consistent, then that becomes a problem for you down the line.
Yeah, one other thing real quick, Mike and Chris, this, hopefully people remember this slide for when we talk later, because, hearing you guys talk, we're using the word document and data, sometimes interchangeably. And so I think one of the big challenges is all of these quote unquote documents obviously exist and are maintained, but nowadays many of them are contained within a database or a cloud-based platform. And so the concept of a document versus where is the data, I think is part of the challenge, right? If you're needing to tell your story, is a lot of this stuff is no longer physical, it's digital. So.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so the last thing, and I almost put an asterisk next to this because it's kind of like, well, of course you monitor the schedule closely, but this goes back to a lot of what Mike had talked about in his portion. Is it's one thing to prepare in the contract a process for and rules around and requirements for how a schedule is to be maintained and for notices regarding the schedule. But if those requirements and obligations and expectations in the contract are not followed through during project execution, that's where you get into trouble, practically speaking. But it's also a problem if you're having to, down the road, explain the decisions and the actions that you've taken with respect to the schedule to either folks on the other side who are complaining about the progress, or to ultimately a judge or an arbitrator once claims have come up. So, and it's not just, from our perspective, it's not just a process of sort of scrambling when issues exist come up, but it's really doing your best. And this applies both to the schedule and to, frankly, every document, every issue that comes up during a project, is reviewing those documents and the data for trends, whether it's the schedule, whether it's, meeting minutes, whether it's correspondence, trying to identify things that are coming up in real time that you have questions about, that you're curious about how it might impact progress down the road, and if necessary, raising those things with the other stakeholders involved, requesting updates, requesting additional information about how things are being done, how certain tasks are being carried out. Those are all fairly standard procedure when it comes to the most sophisticated projects, and there are typically folks who are obviously identified to handle these things. But who on the project do you have who is looking at it through the lawyer's lens, and can be able to say, look, if I'm receiving this as someone who's been involved in litigation, these are my concerns. So all of the things that we would expect to be happening from a practical perspective in terms of monitoring and adjusting the schedule, what we encourage clients to do is think of it not only from a practical perspective, but from a legal perspective. And that's not always easy to do. Obviously, there are business priorities and other non-legal priorities that are very high on stakeholders' lists in terms of completing projects, meeting deadlines, et cetera. But that we have worked with a lot of clients, and our message to them, especially increasingly, and Dave will talk a lot about this too in terms of his own work, is the earlier you can get folks involved who are thinking through that disputes lens, the better, because they can provide an extra level of protection for the engineers and the project managers who are boots on the ground, who are actually in the weeds on a lot of these issues. So that's it for project execution. We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Hey, Chris, before we take a break, I just wanted to mention something on the schedules that I think is important. Oftentimes, clients look at the bottom line of the schedule update. Are we still on time? Is a critical path being impacted? But there are a lot of activities that are near critical path that can get onto the critical path if they slip. And so looking at these schedule updates, you shouldn't focus solely on the bottom line, right? We're still on time. You should look to see, and maybe you ask who's ever providing the update to tell you, are we seeing slippage on some activity? Because that's a heads up to, we may need to focus on this issue because we don't want it to become a critical path activity, right? And so it pays to take a deeper look into these schedule updates to see if you have other activities that are starting to fall behind. And maybe because of float or because they're not on the critical path, it's not impacting the substantial completion date, but it's an issue. And so I just would encourage you, when you see these monthly updates, and I know they're dense and there's a lot of information there, but if you just focus on the bottom line, are we still on time? You may miss the fact that the schedule is showing a significant activity is falling behind. And so that would be the time to say to your contractor or subcontractor, what's going on here? Let's deal with this. We don't want to see this continue to slip. And I've been involved in many disputes and projects where non-critical path activities somehow make their way onto the critical path. And that's something you can see happening if you're getting a good, accurate schedule update, and something you should be looking for as you're going through these updates.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. So all of this is sort of building toward the back end of our seminar today, where Dave will talk about how to use technology and ideas for AI and implementing some of these technologies into your project management process. And it's very much, as you'll learn from Dave, it's very much a moving target. I mean, AI is changing by the day. So, there are a lot of questions that we ourselves even have about, how do you use AI and some of these technologies to make sure that you're drafting a strong contract, that you're properly executing the project during construction, that you're able to maintain documentation, that you're on top of all of these issues that come up on a daily basis. So we're really excited about around these tools and how they work. We're thinking a lot about it and spending a lot of time here in McGuire Woods, and I know Dave is too, trying to suss out how AI and other technologies can be most effective for you all, for the folks who are involved in the projects. And so we very much encourage, once we get into that piece, for you to chime in, for you to post questions through the chat, because we'd love to hear your perspectives, frankly, on what you've seen, how things have worked or not worked for you. So why don't we take a break? We'll reconvene at 10:36 by my clock, or thereabouts, and then we'll continue on with the seminar. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. And before we kick off Dave's portion, we do have a question here, which is, do you see contract clauses changing as they relate to detailed long-term schedule requirements versus less detail in the long term and requiring more detailed short-term schedules while maintaining the long lead schedule items? And I think this is referring to updates to a contract over time, I think, as schedules change. Is that your sense, Mike?
Yes, and I'll share my thoughts, and others can as well. I see a lack of detail in a lot of agreements as to what information is to be provided in these schedule updates and in the short term. And so I think it's important to identify that information in the contract to the extent that you can. I often see you're going to have a CPM schedule. Here's what it's going to have, the activities and so forth. But often there's not detailed requirements about what does the schedule update need to show or focus on in the short term so that you can get an accurate snapshot of where the project is at that moment in time and whether there is an issue that may not be on the critical path yet, but that's coming down the track that you want to get on top of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, and Mike may or may not agree with this, but contract amendments are your friend. I know that they can make things a bit messier, and it's maybe things become, at least in terms of the actual documents that you have to keep track of, not as straightforward. But if there's any lack of clarity, or there is a need from your perspective to make an amendment to the contract to ensure that the schedule update process is clear to both sides, it's better not to assume and better to make changes. All right.
So we've got one other question there, and maybe we'll answer this too through some of the next slides. Have contractors become better at documentation, record keeping, and overall claims knowledge? I'll let Mike and Chris share their thoughts in a minute, but my take is yes, and it's unfortunately by necessity. But I don't know that it's specific necessarily to contractors. I think more about project teams. So if I've encountered a team that's been on a problem project before, not of their own making, but just a challenging project, they sort of know the things that they need to do. A lot of the stuff that Chris talked about, and so I think if people have been burned, for example, by delegated design or something like that, you know what I mean, their ears perk up and they tend to have more of a focus on documentation and record keeping. That's my take, but that's obviously more of a practical approach as opposed to the contract.
And I would say my experience is sophisticated contractors are doing a much better job of documenting and tracking project information. I'm not so sure they're doing as good a job disseminating that information for practical use by the project team. And I would say that on the owner side, that's an issue. In other words, owners, I don't think, are very good at the documentation of project data and disseminating and using that information. I think contractors are better at it, but I think there are challenges for contractors, and again, usefully deploying that information. But oftentimes, owners tend to have a smaller project management team, and I see more challenges on the owner side in having good documentation and record keeping.
Mm-hmm. Yep, all that I agree with. I mean, I think it really depends. The owner is definitely, usually in our work and based on our experience, is at a disadvantage when it comes to documentation, and that's part of the reason why we really advise the clients of ours who are owners to take all of this counsel to heart, I think on the contractor side, it really just depends on the size and sophistication of the contractor and the size of the project team that's available for that particular project. At the end of the day, it really comes down to investment in sort of technology and tools, and then manpower. And I mean, those are really the key pieces on the contractor side. For the contractors who appreciate the importance, I think they're obviously more willing to make those investments. Some not as willing.
It's kind of a perfect segue. We didn't even plan that, Chris. Nice work.
That's right.
All right. So, well, thanks again, Mike and Chris, for having me today. I'm Dave Hedinger with Entropy. I've got a background slide here in a little bit that I'll share a little bit more about my background. But I usually start discussions with this, or like this, with a disclaimer. I know it's a lot of words, but it essentially says three things. One is I'm very comfortable talking about problem projects, but I recognize that some people are not. So, I try to respect, obviously, any confidentiality agreements, anonymizing project details, things like that, because I do think we get a lot out of actually, talking about these challenging situations. The second is Entropy as a company is solution agnostic. So I don't have any, incentive agreements with any software vendors or anything like that. So no mention of any specific solutions is necessarily an endorsement. This is more to be sort of educational about what's out there. And then lastly, this is my caveat. The pace of technological change obviously is pretty rapid, including the AI tools specifically. So some literally came out, within weeks, just weeks ago. So it sort of goes without saying, but some of what we talk about might become outdated fairly quickly, but that's, typical and I think to be expected, which is why I think we want to try to invite as much discussion as we can and make this a safe place for people to ask questions. All right, so here's a look at the agenda. I've got about 20 to 25 minutes worth of slides, but as Chris mentioned at the start, and people have already started using the Q&A, feel free to drop your questions in throughout. Chris is going to keep an eye on that and just let me know if there's something to field. So we've got plenty of time to get through everything, so we can either go through the slides if people don't have questions and talk about them at the end, but I want people to feel comfortable asking it, and we'll try to answer them in as real time as possible. All right, so we'll start with introduction. So again, I'm Dave Hedinger with Entropy. I've spent my entire career pretty much in construction claims, either doing the forensic analysis side or trying to get in front of it with project controls and monitoring. Main areas of expertise are cost, schedule, and productivity. Been at it for coming up on 20 years and been fortunate to work with over half of the top 20 in some capacity. My background is engineering and design, and I started Entropy in 2020 to really help AECO firms to navigate problem projects, before pre-claim. So here's what I mean when I say problem projects. So any complex project is bound to experience some amount of harm over time, but problem projects tend to experience a greater amount of harm and at an accelerating pace. So what we're talking about is essentially detecting this acceleration of harm and then trying to do something about it. So with my background in forensics, what I try and do now is get involved as early as possible, right? Chris and Mike were talking about those kind of buzzwords. Those are things I see typically when I get brought into a project. But then it's a matter of sort of surveying what technologies you have out there, what are your project controls, what's the reporting like, and just trying to put in place safeguards to prepare yourself that if it doesn't get resolved, you're essentially building the puzzle while building the project. That's kind of the concept. And obviously following the contract to a T on the heels of Mike and Chris's part. All right, so before jumping into AI specifically, I thought it was important to sort of level set, not knowing where people are at in terms of their knowledge of construction tech. So, a lot has changed over the last 10 to 15 years, and it continues to change. We mentioned earlier, the idea of the documents and data are sort of, the lines are starting to blur, a little bit in terms of that. So I think that's something we can talk about. But for me in my career, it all seemed to start with this McKinsey article from 2015. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it and probably have opinions about it. I'm not going to get into the differences between manufacturing and construction. If you are interested in that, I did write a white paper that tried to pull back the curtain on what the data underlying these charts really means. And so if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out. I can share that. Today I'm showing it though for two reasons. The first is comparing productivity in manufacturing to productivity in construction is an apples and oranges comparison. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of that. But the second reason, and more importantly, is that this chart, along with the next chart, seemed to set in motion a chain of events that resulted in a significant amount of investment in construction technology. So you saw this sort of impetus for investing in technology and highlighting construction as an opportunity for startups and investors. And I think it was a good thing, but it came with a lot of noise as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So this second chart came out the year later, and it ranked construction second to last in digitization, so just above agriculture and hunting. So again, to outside investors and startup founders, this was sort of like the blood in the water moment. They saw it almost as a mandate to jump into the world's one of the world's most important industries in terms of the economy. So in the years afterwards, you started to see a lot of chatter about opportunities in construction for startups and investors. And again, not all of it was bad, but I think it did generate a fair amount of unfair criticisms, including this perceived failure to adopt technology, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit. But that led to headlines like this one. And so most of these types of articles were obviously marketing ploys. The construction industry does not fear technology, as those of you who are in it will know. But the truth is that many of the technologies that are built for construction, take Primavera, for example, it's extremely powerful. And if you have the people to extract the value out of it, it's great, but it's not necessarily easy to use. And I think that's a theme throughout for some of these technologies is they may be very powerful, but they're not necessarily easy to use. They're a learning curve, and in some cases, a steep learning curve. So anyway, the takeaway here is it can be frustrating at times if it's not well designed to meet this specific need. And I think that's why we, basically had a lot of solutions looking for problems. An Office Space came out 26 years ago, in case that helps anybody orient themselves. So really, why do we use technology? Here's a list, a few reasons I came up with just off the top of my head. By no means is this, comprehensive. Most of these are project management related though, helping to inform decisions. There's obviously some physical or hardware aspects to it as well. But again, regardless of hardware, software, I think for people to use technology, they have to trust it. They have to understand its functionality, but also its limitations. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It helps, obviously, if something is intuitive to use, right out of the box. But most of those well-designed technology products, I'd put PlanGrid in this case, were designed to sort of remove that friction from the start. And I think if you don't do that as a software vendor, it's going to be a long road. But if you check all those boxes, then it's got a good chance of being adopted. The challenge, though, is it can become very overwhelming very quick. So this article is from 2018. It's like being a kid in a candy shop, selecting which construction technologies to implement. I checked PitchBook recently, and the number of companies is now more than double today. And many of these are touting AI and other advanced features. So it does make it hard to keep up. So here's a few slides that just sort of show the lay of the land. And again, by no means is this list comprehensive. It's sourced to Built World's top lists by category. We're going to talk about a little later about AI, obviously, but I think one thing that's really important is to understand that several of these solutions either already have or soon will incorporate AI-related features. So people talk about AI, as if there are AI products, and there are. But there are also existing solutions that are sort of embedding the AI technology within their existing platforms. And Procore is an example of that. So this just came out within the last month. And it's part of what they're calling sort of this Helix artificial intelligence layer. So the agent builder is just one example. They've got Procore Assist and some other things that they're rolling out. But I think this idea of putting AI into the hands of existing customers, it supports the fact that there's, I think, already an expectation from a lot of contractors and customers of software that these features are going to be part of an offering or be available because they're so widely adopted or being used outside of your standard workday. Full disclosure, I've not used this agent builder, but apparently construction teams can create and launch their own AI agents directly inside Procore. Procore also talked about crowdsourcing ideas for how to use this from their customers. And I think that's a good idea, but at the same time, it can become a double-edged sword. You end up sort of developing things, that people can use, but you also want to weigh that with, your core offering in terms of a project management platform. The other thing is that while this could become, very powerful, I do think there's the black box element of artificial intelligence just in general. So I think, for this to be widely adopted, people have to trust it. And I'll be honest, that there's some level of added or really unpredictability when you take away what, the user can actually see and touch and feel and how it does things. So that's something that they're going to have to weigh as it's rolled out. And here's some more categories. These to me start to blend together. So there's 3 different categories on the screen, but I would consider OpenSpace and Cupix to be competitors. So a similar argument could be made for like Reconstruct or Disperse. In actuality, reality capture and site capture has become a pretty crowded space, at least in terms of the software vendors. So to use that dust storm analogy again, I think construction tech in general, I would say, has been a little bit of a dust storm since that 2015-16 timeframe. I think it's settled a little bit, but then COVID happened, and then new tools came out as well. So I think AI, as we're entering this, what I would say is another dust up, a pretty significant one though. But I think it's still a ways away from settling. All right, so now we'll jump into AI a little bit more specifically, starting with, I think, the financial backing that is seemingly coming at it from all directions. So I don't think anybody's disputing that there's AI hype. I think that piece is pretty self-evident. This whole concept of a bubble is, specific to stock prices or valuations, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in that. But here in a recent interview, Bezos characterized it as an industrial bubble, and the bubbles can be good. It's certainly easier for him to say than the rest of us with 401ks. But I think his point is that it's not going away, and I'll explain why that is in just a minute. But part of it is that this push to invest in it, to me, is at such a remarkable scale that innovation, new things that come out are almost bound to happen just based on the investment, assuming obviously that the investment continues. But I think that's his point here, is not necessarily that, whether it's a bubble or not, or what's it going to mean for valuations, but I think it's more that there's so much behind it that it's really not going to be going away. And then there's the infrastructure investment behind AI. So the Stargate project is probably the biggest example. Here's some details about it. I think the key word here is intends to invest, because it says $500 billion over the next 4 years. But I think that this and other types of investment, people have seen it with data centers. Now the challenge is power for those data centers. And so here, the Stargate project, obviously it's backed by, significant financial backing. The first site is in Abilene, Texas, alongside a company called Crusoe, which developed some breakthrough energy technology. And I think that's the other thing that people don't think about necessarily with AI, but I think it's entirely possible and highly likely that ancillary industries like energy, will continue to see innovations almost by necessity to meet the needs of power and other aspects of it. And so if you believe Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, we're going to need it. For those who are interested, I would encourage people to read his congressional testimony from April of 25, right around the same time. So he's saying here that another 90 gigawatts of power is needed in America. So he equated that to, on average, about 90 nuclear power plants. And the acknowledgement that that's obviously not happening. We're building zero. So again, because of that need, I think you're going to find that innovation follows and creates a lot of opportunities, whether or not you buy into the AI hype. You know what I mean? And so we should note that we've built one new build in the last 30 years or so. It's actually where Chris and I met. So that's a little fun fact. Okay, so the hype is real, and the investment, I think, suggests that it's not going anywhere. But what are some of the headwinds? Because I certainly, it feels to me like there are plenty of them. So a few years ago, I was out at a construction tech conference in San Francisco, and the keynote was a former engineering executive from Tesla. He was something like employee number 20 or something like that. But he told a story about his dad, who was a Tesla owner, talking with another Tesla owner at a charging station. And like any proud dad would, he was talking about his son's contributions to the engineering technology and the battery technology. And when he finished, the other Tesla owner said, "Yeah, I don't know about that, but it's just so damn fun to drive." And his point is, having done his entire career into the engineering side of it, but he says what you realize is that by the time the finished product reaches the end user, the technology actually disappears and the focus returns to the experience. And I think that's really important for a discussion of AI, because in some worlds, that is the technology behind it, right? But we're using it to describe the products and the services as well. So the first sort of consumer-facing AI product that gained widespread adoption was arguably ChatGPT. And here's what the product looks like, right? So the user interface. ChatGPT obviously took a page out of Google's handbook, but I think there's some important distinctions here. Google Search has this AI mode, and you've seen it when you've done searches, right? It's optional, or it's in addition to the normal search. And there are studies about sort of what, when you're looking to learn about an activity, what are the pros of getting it synthesized for you in AI mode versus being able to click through the sources. But I do think it's fair to question, like the incremental value of ChatGPT over Google Search. And I think that probably lead to some good discussion, if we were all together. But I think the point is that the Google Search didn't require any learning curve, right? It was pretty intuitive just to use right out of the box. But AI, I think, arguably has a learning curve component to it that Search obviously does not. So if your LinkedIn looks anything like me, you've probably seen a lot of these cheat sheets pop up. And I've saved a bunch of them, but I'll be honest, I don't think I've taken the time to sit down and study them as much as I intended when I saved them. But I think that sort of the learning curve gap has been recognized with some of what OpenAI and others are rolling out now, because I think it's less about the idea of becoming a prompt expert. In other words, asking it the right questions in the right way. And it's more about giving people kind of the building blocks to do it themselves. So there are connectors to other apps that you can plug in, but more recently, and this literally was just a couple weeks ago, OpenAI released this agent kit, and some people are already saying that it's going to wipe out a bunch of apps. How, I'm not exactly sure, but the concept is effectively to close the gap between the idea of something and what it can do and the execution of it. So they're essentially, I think, sort of acknowledging, to some degree at least, that there is confusion in the market. And to address that, I think they're effectively trying to lower the barrier to entry even more. Some have referred to it as sort of a no-code playground. So those of you who are familiar with, instead of coding something from scratch, but using low-code or no-code solutions to build your own application, that sort of concept, they're just leaning into that, I think. And that to me is really interesting, but I think it is a little bit too early to make conclusions about it because, again, customers have to trust it and they also have to like it in order to use it. But in the back of a lot of contractors' minds over the years with adopting technology is the question of build or buy, right? Should I buy something off the shelf and incorporate it into my process, or can we build our own solution, and then we own it? And so this may cause some people to rethink that, but again, it's pretty early. Don't shoot the messenger here, but this is an MIT study that garnered a lot of conversation over AI's effectiveness. It generated a good amount of backlash, I think, from innovators who embrace failure as sort of a step towards growth and learning. And so understandably, it caused a bit of an uproar. I thought this headline from Forbes was a little bit more accurate representation of the study, which is that pilots fail because companies avoid friction. I think that I can sort of wrap my head around. But that's why I try to stay informed, at least for what I do with what's out there, right? I try to keep a pulse on it and understanding its capabilities and its limitations. But then when that opportunity comes that's low risk, that's frictionless, by all means, try something out. I think that's sort of the stage at which we're in right now. I know the pressure to adopt it is immense, but I still think, you need to sort of look for those opportunities and not necessarily force it. So I'm going to show you one example. And again, this is a while ago that I did this. It's probably a year and a half ago by now. But it was an example of my early exploration with AI. And again, sort of a low risk opportunity to leverage it in a meaningful way. So I do a bunch of like cost, schedule, and productivity analyses. And as some of you are probably aware, there are some tools out there that can automate, for example, like the schedule analysis piece of it. But that's really just using the P6 data, right? So you can think of that as sort of answering the what about a schedule analysis, what were the delays? In my experience, it's the why is far more time consuming of an effort. And so establishing causation or essentially a causal link between the impacts caused by others and then delayed damages or increased costs. That is as much an art as it is a science. But, and Chris teed this up earlier, but what it essentially boils down to is storytelling, right? And Mike talked about this earlier too, the importance of the timeline. So, if you consider that telling your story or telling an effective story is what you need to do, AI and large language models, I think, are actually very good at that. So in this case, I worked on a project and I've got a process that I go through if I get involved early enough to start to build that timeline, in the background. So this was something that I had already sort of built. But then what I did was, leveraging large language model, being able to pull it into a list of recurring issues and people knowledgeable. Again, it's a very simple, way of just dipping your toe in the water to sort of get some value out of it. I didn't do it with the intent of actually having it fit a need, but this was extremely valuable for a project that I had. I got a call from an attorney who said he needed to get a letter out the next day and was interested in knowing sort of what are the recurring issues. So able to instantly generate those things can have, practical applications. I've also used this to sort of help with deposition prep, right? You've got subject matter experts across the board on different topics. And I think this shows some promise to be able to do that as well. But I also turned it into a narrative. So, you can essentially think of this as sort of a first draft of a claim or an REA narrative. Obviously, it needs a close review for factual accuracy and tone, but it was actually a pretty good starting point. And I will say, though, that I've tried this with other aspects of data collection. And so, example, an example is daily reports. Again, I've not used the agent builder yet in Procore, but I'm pretty sure it probably can do what I'm about to describe. But I essentially uploaded a database of all daily reports or daily report entries, and then started to query for start and finish dates for contractors, subcontractors, or when the issues were mentioned. And I will say that it was wrong. And that was when I did it the first time, but I was able to test it because I knew the answer, right? So we're experimenting with this stuff. It's okay that it failed, but that's why it was important for me to act as sort of a guardrail or a QA, QC, right, in using it. And so that brings me to some more sort of takeaways from AI exploration. Again, this isn't specific to any one tool or product. It's just sort of what I came up with. And it would be great, by the way, if people had other, takeaways that they wanted to type in the chat, even if they're not, questions, but experiences or observations. So the first is treating AI tools like an eager intern. I heard this once on a panel, and it just resonated with the whole room. The second is, it's good for quick summaries, like I just showed. But I think it's important to not lose sight of the value of experience, right? So yes, these things can present information instantly to you in an organized way, but it's not the same thing as knowledge gained from experience. For those of you who've heard about sort of how they're gonna, AI could be an easy button or replace an aging workforce overnight. I mean, that's just not gonna happen in my view. You can harness parts of that, right? But trust your own experience, you know what I mean, in terms of how you gain knowledge, because I don't think it's not necessarily the easy button that people make it out to be. I'm having limited success with the in-depth research functionality, and maybe I haven't spent enough time with it. Obviously, would love to hear about others' experiences with it. But to date, I've not found a tremendous amount of sort of incremental value. That includes document review. So obviously we've got, in some cases for projects, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of documents. And so, we could talk about this too. I know Mike, Chris, and I have talked a little bit about it, but it sort of bleeds into now like this e-discovery world, right? Which is totally a totally separate, thing from construction technology. But I think what we need to remind ourselves is that I've had as much, if not more, success just sort of scanning email subject lines, right, and opening select ones, versus spending a bunch of time trying to figure out what the right prompt is so that the AI can go get, all the good documents. I think that's still got a little ways to go. These next two go together. So if you are using it to try to build your own sort of AI agents or things along those lines, do expect some limitations on things like file size or location. So, some of this is a function of the vendor, right? Whether it's Box or Microsoft or OpenAI. But when you want or need to, I would assume this is relevant for most of the people on the call, but when you need to sort of partition off certain document sets from the broader AI model, expect to run into some issues with, things like processing time, right? If the document set is too large, or also things like permissions. You'd be surprised about, how challenging that can be to sort of make sure that things are connected where they need to be. But again, I think that's what they're working on now, is to try to lower that bar a little bit. All right. This, I would say, just trust yourself in terms of whether something's ready to adopt or not. Again, if you're building it yourself, keep going. But if you're not, I think it's totally fine to wait, if something's not quite ready. Again, that pressure to adopt is immense, but I think it really should be clear why and when you're ready. So I would say don't force it. And it goes without saying, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. I think understanding that companies, are investing billions in the future of this technology are not doing it just for fun. So they will want a return, and I think, expect to have, this come with an added cost. And I think that needs to be weighed with, the importance of processes and people. These to me are two things that are more predictable than technology, right? And so I do think, while there's this pressure to adopt, and a lot of people are using it sort of as a marketing tool. I would say don't let the tail wag the dog, when it comes to your people, process, and technology.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
Before you move on, I had a question for discussion, and it relates to the AI headwinds, which you've talked about AI headwinds generally. I'm wondering if there are any headwinds specific to the construction industry that have maybe created this situation where, construction is just one of a handful of industries that has been a late adopter when it comes to technology in general. Anything specific about the industry that you think makes really diving into sort of the emerging technologies and figuring out AI and how it can be helpful even more difficult?
It's a great question, and I've got a lot of thoughts on it. So going back to that digitization, right? Like why is construction like second to last? I think a lot of people were like, well, how could that be? I was not as surprised, right? I mean, it was right above agriculture and hunting, like those are physical things, right? And so I don't know that there's any sort of construction specific, but I would say that the same sort of headwinds, or I'll call them friction, you know what I mean, to adopt technologies are likely to be this, same or similar, repeat themselves when the technology becomes even more advanced, right? It's like if you were just getting up the curve and now somebody throws something else at you, I think you're going to be reeling with, decisions about how to incorporate it. But that whole digitization thing, I'm just old enough probably to remember being in a construction trailer and seeing literally a whole wall that had the schedule printout on plotter paper, right? And that was the ground truth, right? I think this whole concept of, well, we got to move to digital, all of a sudden now that schedule is in a bunch of XCRs, in Primavera across the, it might be somebody who's not even on site who's actually doing it, right? And I think the question I think that we have to ask ourselves from like the construction industry standpoint is, is advanced technology better? Or is digitization better, I should say? And I think in some cases, absolutely, but I think in other cases, and this is why I think that natural resistance to adopt technology is a good thing, you know what I mean? Because it means you're asking the right questions, like as opposed to just plugging and playing, right? And so I think, whether you talk about scheduling, or, take BIM, for example, right? I think depending on who you ask in the industry, some people, all they've ever done is, 3D modeling and clash detection, for coordination and things like that. But then I've also had people who are, who recognize the importance of that technology, but they go back and say, is that better than letting the large duct go first, and then the smaller stuff behind it, And so, again, I don't think there's a right answer, you know what I mean, whether to adopt or not. But I think the important thing is asking yourselves, are we making things better, you know what I mean, or are we making them more unpredictable? And I think it's got to be informed by the project team, you know what I mean? So to put a finer point on the answer to your question, I think it's a question of, are people going to, adopt AI knowing that it could be a little bit of a black box, for the things that they don't know themselves, right? The experimentation thing, I think, is good to do on these low risk things because you can determine for yourself whether it's ready or not. You know what I mean? So I would not expect, construction to jump the front of the line and adopt AI wholesale, but I think that's because people can't afford to, you know what I mean, with the margins that you're operating under, the assumptions that you have. And I think we're going to talk about this as part of the discussion, but I do think, the opportunity to sort of think about these things at the time of the contract, right? And put things in place to make it less, or make it more clear, you know what I mean, to the parties, where are the things that we're going to be using, you know, to do X, Y, or Z. You're almost trying to get back to that sort of schedule on the wall in a trailer, you know, where at least everybody knows where it is. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, all right. So this is the last section, and then obviously we open it up more for questions. But, you know, I think talking about sort of what does this all mean for the AECO industry, it sort of gets to your question, Chris, but I think the big picture, you know, starting with what we know, is that construction is about delivering physical assets, right? And I think part of the reason that those who have seen this photo, it was from 2023, but it went viral pretty quick. I think part of it is it highlighted the fact that software, you know, cannot replace the people and processes that deliver the physical assets at completion. And so obviously there was a lot of, you know, sort of poking fun, and people took offense at things, whatever. I thought it was just, it generated a lot of good conversation around the adoption of technology for an industry like construction. And it reminded me of this quote from one of my favorite books, but technology presumes there's just one right way to do things, and there never is. You know, when you think about construction, it's not following a single line of instruction, right? So there are these other industries out there that are, you know, a little bit more, I don't want to say predictable, but they're not project-based, you know what I mean? They may not be as dynamic. So teams are making decisions every day. And I think, you know, project management and construction is as much an art as it is a science. And I think it, you know, in a project-based industry, I think it's okay and really should be expected that teams will use different technologies on their different projects. I think this whole enterprise-wide, you know, rollouts obviously have benefits too, but I think that's more process driven. You know what I mean? When you find a technology that fits within your processes, then yeah, roll it out. But again, otherwise it's this sort of tail wagging the dog thing. And I think I've sat in rooms with mid-size and even large contractors who sort of joke about how many softwares their company uses. I mean, it could be, you know, in the hundreds or something like that. And I think people, again, from other industries would look at that and say, well, why can't you consolidate that? And I think it's actually more of a function of how we do things in construction, you know, making decisions every day. The project team is the owner of their, you know, the outcome of that project. So again, they should be using something that, you know, they're comfortable using to get those, you know, key data points or documents, you know, certainly the record. But how you do that, you know, there's so many different solutions out there now. You know, it could be 5 different solutions that do the same thing. You know what I mean? And I don't care from my perspective with clients what they use. It's just I come in knowing here's what I'm looking for, you know, and then, you know, pretty quickly we identify where it is or how it's being kept. So, so this is an example AI tool that's on the market, Trunk Tools. So it's a ChatGPT for your job site. If this, again, asking yourselves the question, if this or something like it is what you feel you need to help find what you're looking for within your existing platforms, so up there at the top are examples, then it's available on the market now. And along with several competitors, I think the key here for whether it's a company like Trunk Tools or any other similar product is, can they deliver a better user experience than if companies were to build their own agents? So for example, either that OpenAI agent kit, you know, you could conceivably try to do something with that, or now Procore's agent builder. So basically up in the, you know, upper left-hand side, if you're pulling information from Procore, you may have the opportunity to sort of leverage some of these AI tools yourself. But I think that's part of the dust storm that we're watching unfold is, are people going to engage with these tools and use them as building blocks? Or are people going to continue to sort of buy instead of build? And I think that's where the dust is yet to settle. All right. So in case it's not apparent by now, I'm sort of an equal part fan of technology, but also a skeptic. But I think that's important. So I'm going to close with some of what I think are some important things to keep in mind during conversations about tech and/or risk management, but some may surprise you. but I think people and process first. So I like to think of technology as sort of an amplifier. And there's a lot of technology out there that will promise to save you minutes in a day, right? Add up those minutes, and that's your ROI. But I think the key question for those of you who obviously are still in the business of building projects is, is this going to be enough to improve my margin, right? If I'm a contractor, or, from an owner's perspective, it's, you sign up for something thinking you're going to pay a price and get an asset at the end of the day. But I think the question is, can the use of technology continue to help, when it comes to risk management? And obviously Mike, alluded to that earlier, but I think that could also be, as much process or contract as it is the actual technology. Bottom line drivers. So, focusing on a small number of key drivers of risk and exposure. We talked about the fact that there's data everywhere. But, when I get involved in a project, I tend to gravitate towards, a small amount of very meaningful data. It might be something that's highlighted, by the fact that the design is incomplete, or they're finishing the design through the RFI process. When you start to understand sort of what are the key components of it, I think that will tell you where you should invest, in technology. If you're already, I don't want to say behind the eight ball, but if you recognize that this is going to become the story that we have to tell effectively, I think it's more important to focus on a small number of things that really drive your risk or exposure, as opposed to looking at it from a big data problem. You can always do these sort of metrics, but I think you've got to be able to tell an effective story, with the anecdotes, right? With something that's an arbitrator or somebody could follow at the end of the day, or a judge. Letting the contracts guide. So most, if not all, projects that I get involved with are under contract already. So you can't go back in time and undo, or, pretend you didn't sign the contract. But I think, the good thing about having that in place, and Chris talked about sort of the cheat sheet. I've done that, with clients before, when it comes to the damages piece, right? What do you need to do to prove up a time extension? There's typically that process is laid out. But I think the good thing is that can tell you, I know there was a lot of talk about notice, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment on that. I think of, notice obviously depends on the state, but to me, the more, the tougher clauses to really unpack are these gray areas, right? Things like, whether it's no damage for delay or pay when paid. I think understanding how those parts and pieces move together can help inform, where you need to track things, or how you need to track them, to put yourself in the best position, to prevail on a claim or defend one. All right, so sticking to the fundamentals here. Well, actually, project premortems, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's essentially the concept of, assuming in your head that the project has failed, based on what you know today. And it's really surveying the project team to say, okay, if it did fail, what would be the reason for that? You got to be careful, obviously, whether it's that or things like lessons learned. But I think if it's done through counsel and done through the right way, it can be, important. And I see it as sort of an exercise that, what we're talking about here is sort of closing the gap, right, between, say, a general counsel or outside counsel and that project team. I think it can be a good, exercise to do that, low risk, in terms of, what it might yield. But at the same time, be mindful of things like privilege and how you go about it. So I'm not going to talk about safety. Safety is obviously a fundamental, but I'm not an expert in it. But I will talk about cost, schedule, and productivity. So some of these things, again, you may have these features or capabilities within something, but at the end of the day, in terms of costs or cost overruns, it's really about mapping actuals back to the bid or budgeted line items. So if these things, introduce, obviously there's reasons to track things in different codes, and the more you can do that, the better. But at some point, you've always got to get back to the costs and what drives that. And so things like, general conditions or extended time related costs, that's going to be very dependent upon the schedule, right? The schedule analysis. So, teams, I think, are aware of those things, obviously, but not everybody's aware of sort of the damages theory, and how you'd actually go about packaging that. And then the effectiveness of mitigation strategies. So this to me is, people will, regardless of what party you are in a project, you will put forward the bullet points of things you're trying to do to make things better. But be mindful of what those things actually mean for you, right? So where is your risk in terms of the contract? If you're an at-risk productivity, and people, a mitigation strategy may not be just throwing people at the problem, right? It might be actually reducing headcount to improve productivity. So I think in cases like that, just be aware of what those mitigation actions actually mean and whether they have costs associated with it. Because if you can track that in real time, it's going to be easier for you, down the road. And schedule, we talked a decent amount about. The one thing here is I'd say think of it as a dual purpose, right? It's there to help you build the job. That's the most important thing, but it's also there to help tell a story of what happened later. And I think we see it all too often when the schedule becomes unwieldy or gets locked up with constraints or whatever. That really makes it hard to understand what actually is the schedule telling you. So to Mike's point earlier about the near critical path, a lot of what I've done in terms of schedule analysis during a project is to sort of kick the tires on what's in there. And you can think about it as sort of peeling the onion, right? So you've got obviously the most critical path, but then you've got these near critical paths. And I will say that effort, even though I know it's tough for people to sort of prioritize among all the other things, but it can yield some pretty significant insights or findings. Again, Mike talked about, turning information into an insight. This is probably a project that Chris and I worked on at some point, but I recall seeing, a contractor path that was essentially on a 24/7 calendar, and was near critical or whatever. I mean, essentially what that did was spring load, that path so that it wasn't on the critical path. And if that's, what they choose to do with the schedule, I mean, obviously you look at the contract, but that would at least make you ask the question, is that even feasible? What's the plan, that you're going to go through to actually achieve that? Because in my mind, it was sort of using the schedule to, at least buy themselves a month, to figure out what they were going to do. But in the meantime, that made its way into the monthly report, So now it's in there. And if you didn't ask the question then, to Mike and Chris's point, you may be playing catch up later. And then productivity, I mean, we talked a little bit about this, but, people think of it as the same as production. It's not, the basically putting work in place or how fast can you do it. That's sort of this, idea of production, but productivity, rears its ugly head. People get a crash course in it when, things are at risk from a productivity standpoint. You made assumptions for your unit rates. And then, typically it's not just one impact, but it might be death by 1,000 cuts that puts in place this sort of need to try to establish a causal link between impacts and costs. That is very important, but I think it's also acknowledged to be very much a challenge. So again, the tools are there from a technology and tracking standpoint to be able to at least make the effort, to do things. But I think it does sort of you need to weigh it with is this going to be good for the project, or am I just doing this to prepare for a claim? And I think you've got to strike the right balance of, making sure you're, measuring things against the baseline, but at the same time taking opportunities, to add things in there to help track, for later. And then the last thing is just, storytelling. So this is sort of a theme, but stories are how we retain knowledge and information, right? So effective storytelling in terms of a dispute is critical. I mean, some of these projects are years long and there's so much data and information, but then, and Mike and Chris can attest to this, but it might be a week-long or 2-week-long hearing, So you might have millions of documents, but at the end of the day, it may come down to just, the top 200 documents, are going to make or break the case. And I mean, it's probably an oversimplification of it. But I think the point is that, you've got all these tools out there, but I think at the end of the day, you need to return to the simple, question of, can I tell an effective story? And you can't control entitlement necessarily, or, certain facts and things like that, actions by others, bad actors, things like that. But what you can control is, the effective storytelling piece of it. And so that, to me, again, I'm not a lawyer. I know how important, the contract is and entitlement and all those things. But where I try to focus with, the parties is really trying to make sure that, your storytelling is both effective and robust, well supported and backed up. Because no matter what happens in terms of the dispute, if you've got that information readily available, it can be useful in a number of different venues, depending on what happens. So, all right, that's it for me, Chris and Mike. If we want to get into any questions or people have comments, initial reactions.
Yeah, I have a couple comments. I'm sure Mike does too. And again, for folks who are online, we're well ahead of schedule here. So, we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions too. It occurred to me during the presentation that we're really talking about two different applications for AI and technology, at least from my perspective. One is, AI and tech as it can be used for sort of legal purposes in construction, and then AI and tech for how it can be used practically during construction, by construction. And, I think on the legal side, and we're really, at McGuire Woods and Mike and I and our teams, we're really thinking about both of those applications, right? How can we be more nimble and more efficient in what we do from a legal perspective, but also, and this is a bit outside of our direct sort of bailiwick, because we're lawyers and not project managers, but given our expertise and experience working on large projects, both on the owner and construction side or contractor side, how can a lot of these technologies now, AI, be used by the clients themselves? And I mean, I think it's still, and I mean, you alluded to this, Dave, in your presentation. There's still a lot of questions out here in terms of how these technologies are developing, what AI will be capable of doing, as you get further down the road. I mean, some of the things that we've already identified from a legal perspective that AI can be useful for, and general applications that could also apply to construction project management. But obviously, one of the big benefits of AI is that these tools, whether it's ChatGPT or Harvey or some of the tools that are being developed specifically for lawyers, the technology can take a massive amount of information and organize it, spit it out, summarize it incredibly fast, right? And so, that's useful for us and frankly for clients in terms of things like, whether and Dave mentioned it, we're still not entirely sure about how this will impact sort of long-term document review efforts, but certainly there are ways in which we could just funnel large contracts or large documents into an AI tool and ask it to spit things out for us that would probably take us a lot longer to identify or find if we were just thumbing through the contract page by page. And similarly, things like, whereas maybe 5-10 years ago, we'd have an associate sit down and summarize a deposition contract for use in preparing for a hearing or preparing for a cross-examination of a witness. Now we're testing out AI tools to be able to do things like that for us and help to make those types of activities faster. So I guess my point is simply that it's all a learning process, but there is an extent to which, at least we're looking at it from two angles, right? From like, how can it make us more efficient, but how can it make the client more efficient?
No,
Yeah.
I think you. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say the real value I see as this technology continues to emerge. You were talking, Dave, about the storytelling. And in most disputes I've been in, we'll hire somebody like Dave to put together a PowerPoint that tells the story, right? It'll refer to an email, and then a weekly report, then a monthly report, then a schedule update, and the story starts to emerge. And in many instances, I can see the project team for my client saying, huh, I'd forgotten about that. I, I didn't realize that that had been the case. And so to try to move that storytelling into real time, right, when the project is ongoing, to me is the real advantage to this technology as it's being fleshed out. Because many times when that story emerges, and it takes a long time, right, processing, as Dave was saying, hundreds of thousands of documents, and it distills down to a few documents that tell the story. And again, oftentimes the project team is a little surprised because it's, there's a lot going on, it's a complex project, and key issues sort of fell out of their train of thinking. So to move that ability to evaluate what's happening on the project up into project management, to me, is a real promise of this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with both of what you said. I think, Chris, the what you were touching on, I think is I'm seeing it very much. So the idea of leveraging a technology to get an answer quickly, right? That stuff exists. I mean, even what you just described, people on if they're into construction tech are probably familiar with a company called Document Crunch that has sort of capitalized on this idea of finding things quickly, right, in these lengthy contracts or spec sections. I think, though, that my take on an understanding of contracts, I mean, Mike, hearing you talk about change orders, right, should be pretty straightforward, right? Here's a change condition, here's what we agreed to, here it is. But then even that can't be agreed upon. And so my take on, whether it's the AI crunching of a contract or doing, a control F in a PDF and trying to find the clause that you're looking for, to me, those are things, at least from my perspective, I cannot control, right? You guys are going to either draft the contracts or argue, whether case law is relevant and so on and so forth. But I think where my head is at is that storytelling. If you can think about from the start of a project to the end, if I had to tell the story of what happened here, what did I anticipate, right? And what actually happened, and drawing those differences and obviously drilling down into the delays or the overruns. That to me can inform a strategy from the point at which you're, signed up for a contract to, okay, now what is the project team going to be using? You know what I mean? In execution. And by the way, that project team might have turnover, right? This project might be 3-4 years long, something like that. So, I mean, keeping a pulse on that, I think, is going to save you time on the back end. But the other thing we didn't really talk a ton about is, if it doesn't get resolved, I think the industry is begging for a solution to this problem. Is the whole idea of, okay, we've got all this data and technology or data and documentation that's been generated for the job, but now we've got this e-discovery process, right? That is informing best practices or control what's in evidence, what's not. And so I actually think, back to, you showed that slide in Chris's where you have all the document types, right? And Mike was talking specifically about like the monthly reports. That's an official document, you know what I mean, that gets sent once a month, that is final when it's final. But I think what we need to do a better job of is identifying those data sets, and they might be documents, they might be meeting minutes or whatever, but is where are those going to be kept and maintained? And then I think the question is, okay, well, if they're official, I should get access to them. Whether it's I'm an owner or, a contractor. I think the technology people love to talk about sort of common data environment. And, it's sort of like this utopia of, this is how the perfect project would go. But I think realistically, the information exchange, for better or worse, is a lot of times informed by contracts and what people are entitled to see. But I think we need to do a better job of defining, those official document types up front, and then where are they going to be used and housed throughout the job, and then who's going to have access to them. And I think those things can help inform, unfortunately, if it gets to the arbitration or litigation phase and you do incur a bunch of e-discovery costs, the parties can agree, though, to, not take a bunch of data off of one platform just to put it onto another one. You know what I mean? I mean, I've had to do that for jobs, and it's, I think there's a lot of waste in that process that can probably be, ironed out ahead of time, and save a lot of clients, costs when it comes to the dispute.
One thing I wanted to mention about this concept of collecting data and analyzing it to come up with backup support for a claim, or perhaps to push back on a claim, is to what extent that effort is privileged. And I've seen many disputes where contractors have gone through a process of evaluating the claim and start off in one direction, then go in another direction, and then still another direction to come up with the final, here's what we think happened. And oftentimes I'll see in-house counsel CC'd on some of those emails. They're sending these reports around, and everybody thinks that means they're privileged and the other side will not see them. Well, that is typically not the case. It's more deemed to be a business activity than a legal activity. And so I just mentioned that as you're going through and reviewing this data and coming up with your background information, your story of what the claim is or what it's not, as you're going through that iterative process, that's typically discoverable unless you take certain steps. And just CCing in-house counsel is normally not enough. And so it's just something to think about. It's, that's a whole separate topic of attorney-client privilege in this kind of context. But I have seen many cases where we've been able to obtain somewhat helpful information of what the genesis of the claim was, and then it changed, right? And so then you say to the side, well, what happened? Why you said this, and then you said that, and it starts to make it look like you're, I won't say making something up, but you're sort of grasping at a theory. And even though that's not what's going on, that's the appearance. And so as you're looking at this data and using it the way we've discussed, that's something to keep in mind. Is it going to be discoverable if we end up in a dispute? And is there a way to protect it?
Yeah, I obviously won't comment on the privilege piece of it, but it's always a conversation when I get involved, right? Because the writing's on the wall and people want to protect it. I will say that, without even getting into privilege or not, I think it's really important. And we used to do trainings, at times for project teams in terms of not even what to say or what not to say, but the tone of it, right? So, obviously people have certain ways of I'll say, going about their business or, driving a schedule, for subcontractors, et cetera. But I think it's important to, yes, be cautious or thoughtful with how you, draft things, right? And I've always been, told, and I took it to heart early, but, if you can imagine being asked about, a situation, whether it's a deposition or whatever, being able to explain what you meant by something or what was the basis for it. Obviously, that's going to be a lot of what Mike, you or Chris, might do with a person in prep, right? Going through documents and trying to familiarize themselves with what, the words on the page mean. But for what I do, I'm obviously overly cautious with the communications and what is being, what's the ultimate goal here. And very rarely is it, yeah, we can't wait to get to arbitration. You know what I mean? It's more like we're trying to settle this, you know what I mean? There is that rip the Band-Aid off moment from a notice standpoint, which I feel, for project teams, once they go on notice, things could get worse, you know what I mean, from a communication and relationship standpoint. So I think you always need to weigh that. But I think, the privilege piece of it, I guess I always think of it very sort of specific or narrow to, like you just said, Mike, legal versus, business. But even doing that, I think, that some people could see that as a barrier to either going about a pre-mortem exercise or lessons learned or whatever. But I think if you do it in the right way to say, yeah, we're running a construction business here. You know what I mean? We don't win, or our margins, are dependent on these high risk projects, and we want to get better at them, and we want to try to avoid a dispute. You know what I mean? You can usually couch things to try to at least, inform that this is still a business that you're running, and not necessarily winning the dispute is the best thing, the only thing that matters. So I try to adjust or adapt how I operate, based on direction from council, obviously. But I do think it's a very important question when it comes to the technology piece, because quite frankly, I think there's a lot of fields in these technologies, these data that's out there, a notes field, that when I've come across them, I'm like, man, there is a 95% chance that council doesn't even know that field exists. You know what I mean? And here's why it's important and whatnot. So yeah, it's as much an art as it is a science, that whole thing, but it's very real. And I think encounters, we encounter it on pretty much every project that I work on. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, to point out that, we obviously, we structured this presentation as AI and emerging technologies. And that was very specific because, as Dave made clear in his presentation, AI is still in its infancy. There's a lot, obviously, that the technology can do, and we're learning every day all the different the different ways that it can be applied to all of these different industries and projects and work streams, et cetera. But a lot of this is, put AI aside, a lot of what we're discussing and proposing doesn't necessarily require advanced AI, right? What it really requires is an understanding of, fairly basic technology and an acknowledgement of the need to invest in applying that technology at the beginning of the project so that you are better equipped, 5 years down the road, and you don't have to scramble to potentially pay even more money to try and gather all of that information at the back end. And we're hopeful, we're certainly hopeful that, as we learn more and as you all learn more, we will be better equipped to use AI very specifically to do those types of things. But, realistically, a lot of this you can do and position yourself very well without the advanced AI. And I think that's a really important point to leave here with, because it's technology, but it's also just, frankly, it's manpower. It's people who are in the right place to manage these different pieces of the project team, and it's an understanding. It's a learning process of understanding what the contract says, how it's going to be applied and used down the road. The more willing you are to invest in those things early on, and then use technology to help you, as the project moves forward. How can we most efficiently gather the information? How can we most efficiently organize it? How can we most efficiently track it? Those are the most important pieces, I think, to take from that.
Absolutely. So I'll give you a perfect example. I showed a slide earlier about like the reality capture, right? And Cupix, OpenSpace, Disperse, Reconstruct, Multivista. There's a bunch of solutions out there. For those who aren't familiar, most of them are sort of a Google Street View for your project, right? You can jump back in time and look at, really walk the building. If you took that opportunity to walk the building. And so Mike, earlier was talking about some of the key, pieces of documentation, talked about photos. Photos are great. A lot of people often say, well, yeah, we got photos of that. And then you gather, dust them off and look at them. And they might show it, to somebody who's very familiar with that issue, but it might not be clear to somebody who's not. You know what I mean? What is it that I'm actually looking at? And so I've had projects that once I learn that exists, it becomes extremely valuable to jump back at a point in time or look at where drywall is relative to, enclosure or whatever. And so that's something that, literally I've had conversations with project teams that are like, yeah, we use it because we have a, enterprise-wide whatever, but I'm not really sure, we have a project engineer go out there once every, I don't know, couple weeks or something like that. And like a very small tweak to that, if you realize that it could become an issue down the road, is, do that with a cadence that every week, you know what I mean? This project engineer goes out there because you don't know whether you're going to need to see it on November 17th or June 8th or whatever. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've been like, oh, it's great. They've got this valuable resource or tool. And then I jump back to when I need it. And it's like, oh, we didn't walk that day. You know what I mean? So, and I'm not saying, go overboard with it in terms of do it every day or constantly have it on or anything like that. But I think it's just an example of these things are already part of your, digital transformation or whatever you want to, whatever efforts you're doing to explore using technology. I just don't think everybody's necessarily thinking of them as, assets to then later use as storytelling. You know what I mean? Because that to me is what cuts through some of the clutter is, you're always going to have emails and those are always going to become probably the most important piece of the e-discovery process. But the more that you can educate either the other side or an arbitration panel, show them what it is that you're talking about and tell that effectively, that's what it all boils down to at the end of the day. And I think these tools you're absolutely right. They don't necessarily need to even be AI, but if you think about it in terms of that storytelling piece of it, it can help inform decisions about whether it's worth investing in or not, I think,
So, full disclosure to everyone who's still with us here, this is a seminar that every year we've typically done in person, and we decided to do it online this year to make it easier for folks to attend. The downside of doing it online is that we don't have you all in the same room to sort of have an active conversation with. And so, we'd love to hear from, any of you in the chat comments to the extent that you have observations or, additional questions about AI or anything else that we discussed with respect to risk mitigation. We'd love to hear from you. And we've certainly got a lot of time left here in our allotted schedule, but at the same time, everybody's time is precious. So we're also more than happy to give folks back time if that's the better approach.
I feel like, Mike, you and Chris did a great job of making things very clear to people. And then I came in and I just kicked the dust up and made it, But it is, the dust is yet to settle with a lot of this stuff. So, yeah.
And so I think at this point, we can go ahead and wrap it up. Again, as Chris was saying, if you have any questions or would like to have a follow-up conversation with us, very happy to do that. I think this is an important topic. As Dave was saying, AI is not going away. The technology advances are going to be significant, and how we apply them in the construction industry is going to be vital to successful projects. And so we appreciate everybody's time in joining us. And again, if you have any questions at all, just feel free to reach out to us directly. We're happy to have additional discussions about these issues.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.